urinary system is the main excretion system of the body. It is the primary means by which the body gets rid of toxins, controls the levels of ions in the body, controls the amount of water in the body, the pH, and the red blood cell production. Perhaps we think of the urinary system as one of the most basic systems of our bodies, but that cannot be further from the truth. It performs a good amount of complex functions. First of all, your body has two kidneys, one on each side of the body, though the right side is somewhat lower because the liver takes up so much space. The kidneys are held firmly in place by serous membrane, which is also called visceral peritoneum. This ensures that they do not move and that they remain stable. They are one of the few organs that are so suspended they are not affected by violent movement of the body. Also supporting the kidneys is a lot of adipose tissue called perirenal fat. All this keeps the kidneys in place so they can work effectively. Now let's look at the actual anatomy of the kidney. First of all, we have the renal capsule, which is made of fibrous connective tissue is surrounding the entire and encasing the entire kidney. Next, we have the cortex, which is essentially the outer edge of the entire kidney, from this section all the way around. And then we have the medulla, which is the inner region of the kidney. It is made up of rough, cone-like structures called renal pyramids. These renal pyramids are located throughout the kidney. There are not just simply 5 of them, but there are more in each kidney. These are actually, the tips of these pyramids are called renal papillae, and they point into the funnel-shaped structures that are called minor calyx. Now these minor calyx, urine that is formed in the pyramids comes through this structure, and they converge to make major calyx, which are, you can't see them very clearly in this diagram, but they are behind here and actually behind the arteries and the veins. Next we have the renal pelvis, through which the urine exits the kidney, and then further it goes down into the ureter until it goes into the bladder to be stored. Next we have the renal. The renal column is actually the fibrous structure throughout the kidney that keeps it hard and stable. Next we have the renal vein, which the renal vein and the renal artery. Now the dirty blood, you could say, comes in through the renal vein until it is filtered by the kidney, and then it is taken back out of the kidney through the artery. Now I already mentioned somewhat of, this is the big picture of what happens in the kidney, but we can actually go down to a much smaller scale and actually see what goes on even further. And that is if we look at the functional unit of a kidney, which is the nephron. Now the nephron is basically where all of the work gets done in the kidney. This is where we see all of the action take place. So first of all, we have our bean-shaped structure right here, which we call the renal corpuscle. And in this, we have the Bowman's capsule, which is the harder part on the outside edge, and then we have the actual glomerulus, which is actually capillaries, which are very porous, which means that lots of things can go in and out of those capillaries. So we have those two in our renal corpuscle. But also after that, we do have the proximal tubule. We have the loop of Henle, and not all nephrons have a loop of Henle. Simply this one does, simply for the sake of discussion. And then we have the distal tubules, and I'll get to all these functions in just a second. I'm just trying to get them all out there so we can more effectively talk about them. And then we have the collecting duct, where once it is all taken care of, it all goes through here, and this all goes out to the renal pelvis, which is that major outtake out of the kidney. So then we can see, actually to see where this is in the kidney, we can see that this is, all of this is actually in the cortex. This section is on the outer edge of the kidney, and this in here is the medulla. So you can see how this kind of fits into the big picture of the kidney. As we look at all this, we've seen that the word renal has come up several times. But what does this actually mean? It means of or relating to kidneys. So it is easy key. This is an easy key to help us remember that some of these vocabulary words actually relate back to the kidneys if we see that specific word, renal. So now let's actually take a look at the actual functions of the urinary system. Now there are about 6 major functions that the kidney performs. The first one, and perhaps the most important, is that of urine formation. Now, the textbooks provided a good illustrations of how the kidneys function. If you are cleaning out a drawer, for instance, it would be much easier to dump everything out and then pick out only the good things to put those back into the drawer to keep the good stuff. That is essentially what the kidneys do in urine formation, where they filter the blood, reabsorb the good, and secrete the bad. So first of all, there are many steps to actually forming the urine. The first step is that of filtration of blood. And this is what we can see right here that happens in this diagram down here that actually goes through these different processes of urine formation. And filtration actually happens mainly in this specific area. As I already told you, these are capillaries that are very porous, so blood flows freely throughout those. The blood enters the lumen of the Bowman's capsule through the very porous glomerulus capillaries. Then it is filtered through the filtration membrane, which is also a part of the capillaries. And GFR is an acronym we use for the glomerular filtration rate, or the rate at which filtrate is produced in glomerular filtration. It then exits through the proximal tubule. Now the proximal tubule performs the next function of urine formation, which is reabsorption. The walls of this tube are very thin and allow for relative flow through the walls, allowing the substances of the blood to pass across the wall and back into the capillaries if need be. There are 2 methods of reabsorption. The first one is passive and the second is active. As you may tell from the etymology of the words, the passive essentially means that it can flow back and forth throughout the membrane without any assistance at all. However, active does take some specific things to be done, and most substances that must be passed out through active transportation actually need a certain molecule to allow them to pass through. The amount of substances that can pass through is called the Tmax, or the tubular maximum. It filters through the proximal tubule, and then it goes through the loop of Henle to allow for further reabsorption, and then finally it goes to the distal tubules. And this is where the next step, or secretion, occurs. Some things must be secreted back into the nephron, including potassium ions and hydrogen ions. This helps with another factor of the kidney's pH control, which we will get to later. The next step of urine formation is actually water reabsorption. So we already have filtration, which happens in this area, reabsorption, which happens in this area, and then we have secretion, which happens in the distal tubule area. But water reabsorption is actually happening throughout all of these different phases. No matter where the tubule is, water can escape back to the blood if it needed to be, to make up the blood plasma. That moves us on to our next function of the nephron and the kidneys, and that is the blood pressure control. So we know that blood pressure is very important, but the kidneys actually affect this significantly. Since the kidneys affect how much water is in the blood, they can also affect the blood pressure. It can affect the blood pressure by regulating the blood sodium levels. This triggers a protein that then interacts, this protein, renin, actually interacts with angiotensinogen, which then interacts with angiotensinogen 1 to produce a peptide. This peptide, or this converting enzyme, actually then produces the angiotensin 2, which can actually then go back to the kidney, so we see that there will be a salt retention and the blood pressure will rise. So the kidney can sense whether the blood pressure is decreasing or the blood pressure is rising. And this is another example of a negative feedback system, which we talked about earlier in the text. The next point to bring up is that of pH control. Now this equation is a chemical equation of what we did last week in our labs, which was whenever we made our bicarbonate buffer system. Now a buffer system is a mixture of an acid and a base which resists changes in the pH. And that is the whole reason for the buffer system, is that to resist the change in the pH levels. But we have to ask ourselves, why is this important? Well, because it can affect the metabolism via the enzymes and also can affect muscle contraction. So we can see that it is a very important aspect of what the kidneys do. is they allow for this bicarbonate ion in this carbonic acid to actually intermix to allow for the bicarbonate buffer system. The next function of the kidney is that of erythropoiesis, which in simple terms is the production of red blood cells. If the kidneys detect low oxygen, then they will produce erythropoietin, which signals the bone marrow to increase blood cell production. So the blood cells are producing or do not have enough oxygen within themselves, and that means we are depleting our red blood cell count, and we need to actually increase that by stimulating the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. The final function that I will discuss of the kidneys is actually that of activating vitamin D. Now, we all know we get vitamin D through interaction with our sun. However, that would be completely useless to us if we did not have a way to utilize it. We utilize it through the kidney, which actually activates this to allow the vitamin D to perform its essential hormonal functions. The last thing that the kidneys do is, beyond even just making the urine, they actually transport the urine. Now, the path of the urine, and I will go back to the actual, to the kidney so we can see what is actually going on. The collecting ducts, which we had in our nephron, actually dump into the minor calyces, which then dump into the major calyces, which dump into the renal pelvis through the ureter, and then they go to the urinary bladder, which then exits the body. In conclusion, our bodies are made about of 60% water, and the kidneys filter that and the blood plasma about 20 to 25 times per day. So we can see that the urinary system is a seemingly simple yet incredibly complex system that works very efficiently and is essential to our way of living. Thank you.